Let's get started. Welcome to the Writing with Depression panel. I'm very happy to have you all here, and can you start by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your work and what brings you to this panel? Let's start with Michael.
Hi everyone, my name is Mike Edmonds. I go by MJ on social media. And what brought me here today is partially because I did write a book about writing with depression last year, and it was different techniques that I've used. I've set up in a top 10 type of list. But I mostly write fantasy, and I dabble in horror as well. And I've been doing it for a very long time. So part of why I wanted to be with this panel is not just because I wrote something related to it, but because mental health is a very important subject to me. I had previous relationships where they were in the field, and I learned a lot about it through them. And so I want to do what I can to help others.
Jasmine?
Yeah, I'm Jasmine Gower. My pronouns are, I'm actually pronoun indifferent, so she, he, they are all fine. I am a fantasy author and a freelance editor. Most of my writing is very focused on queer and disabled fantasy in particular. So that's kind of my brand. And that's about what I've got going on right now.
All right. H.E.?
Hi, I'm H.E. Casson. Obviously, I exist with depression. We're like roommates. It's cool. And I wanted to join this panel because I feel like there's a lot of sort of, you have to do this to write with depression, or you have to do that to write with depression. And I think the nice thing about a conversation is that hopefully, I think we're going to see that everybody does it differently. And I think the more people we have talking about it, the more people can see that maybe what they're doing, they're being too hard on themselves. Give yourself a break. You're writing with depression. That in itself is awesome. So.
And I think I'm last. So I'm Khaki Olson. I write pretty much every genre I can think of, but I'm published in science fiction, fantasy, nonfiction, poetry, etc. And I was diagnosed with depression in 9th grade, around the time that I started really getting into writing in the first place. And then when I was 23, I developed post-traumatic stress disorder. And I have had a number of characters who have had some kind of mental health crisis or some kind of a lingering condition, as well as ones who really should be in therapy but just won't go there.
There are a lot of fictional characters who should be in therapy.
Well, I like to kind of explore the fact that mental health is not only something that we should be aware of, but something that we should be aware of its prevalency. And so I'm looking for more representation and understanding of the author's influence on that sort of writing.
I love that. So for the first question, how has your depression impacted your writing and your ability to be creative as a writer, both in terms of how it impacts your output and how it impacts the stories you actually tell?
I can answer that pretty quickly since I was just on the topic of it, but in both of my Tchaikovsky ballet fairy tale retellings, the desire to tell the story came out of looking at a flaw within the story and trying to put it into a more workable scenario, something where it can be adapted or something where it can be treated or responded to in a different way than the unhappy ending that we usually get in ballets or operas. And so I dealt in one story with a character who is struggling with her place in the world and does actually go to therapy. But in the other one, it was going through the process of grieving. And so it was a way for me to look at a character from the point of their greatest vulnerability and tell the story of their bravery from that.
That's deep.
I try.
So who wants to follow that up?
You repeat the question? Okay, because my brain's already gone like, phew, that was good. Now I've got nothing left.
Come on, I'm not the smartest person in this room or even 500 rooms, but anyway.
Yeah, so I can go next. So this is going to be kind of a repeat of what I said in the Writing with Anxiety panel, if anyone was there for that, because I've got them both, so that's a fun combo to exist with. But one of the things that anxiety and depression really does to me is it really drains my energy levels pretty fast, and I have to manage, kind of parcel out my energy for work versus writing work, and then like day job work too, and socialization and just doing chores, and it's all a lot to manage with not a lot of mental resources to go between everything. So that's been something that really affects the way that I write. I'm a pretty slow writer as a consequence of that. And as for the content in my books, I do have a lot of depressed characters. That's about as deep as it goes. Sometimes I just got some depressed dragons in my fantasy stories.
I've got a
Major
dragon with a
dragons.
panic disorder, as Diana knows. So it happens in all races and cultures.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those poor dragons.
I know.
Aichi?
So as far as my actual practice of writing goes, when my depression is, the flow of the ebb and flow, I can't write. Like, I'm not gonna write. Sometimes I can't read. I have to sort of figure out what are the parts of writing that aren't writing and work on those. So I will organize what I've already written. I will transcribe. I'll try to read. I'll listen to podcasts about writing, because writing itself is it takes a lot of brain power. And when my brain is like, I have no power today, I've learned in the last 20 something years to sort of go, okay, that's okay. It's okay that today, if all I did today was survive to write tomorrow, that's it. That's good enough. That's my writing for today. And so it does have that effect on my actual writing practice, is that, I accept my pace is different than, that write every day and publish every month and blah, blah, blah. No, nope. For my stories, I almost feel like it's like a mood or a genre that kind of, I don't even know if it's like so much specifically that it's a content thing as that I think it flavors everything I write, whether or not there's a character that, like, my own narrative voice is a voice that includes my multiple mental illnesses. So depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and I'm also neurodiverse. So, I mean, that I can't tell, but I know it's there, that there's something about my voice that carries that over.
That's really interesting. Michael Edmonds? I don't know why I just read your whole name.
That's
It's
like
there.
he introduced
It's there. My brain
himself
just
as
went.
For me, I notice my highs and my lows. That's the biggest thing. When I'm at a low point, I have no energy. I'm staying up too late, sleeping too much, always tired. And during those times, I generally get absolutely nothing accomplished. I'll notice, and I've been paying attention to the pattern, I'll suddenly have this desire to just put a whole bunch of different ideas in action. The other day, I suddenly got this idea, just completely frustrated with the tropes in fantasy, and started just going to town on writing out something that was deconstructing every single one of them. And while the concept is fun, when I'm at my low point, it's one session, 1,000 words or so, and then it gets put into the pile of keep for later.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm at my height, when I'm in essentially the manic stage of everything, I go through so much stuff. I'm the most productive. I work on editing and fixing stuff up and marketing and planning. And then over time, It is. It's an ebb and flow. In my writing specifically, I know, like I just said, I'll come up. I won't focus on any major projects when I'm in a depressed state. But I don't really think that it comes through. It's more that what I'm working on will tell you how I'm feeling. So people who know me, they saw me during the first few weeks of the lockdown in March. I was updating my blog every day. I came up with something new every single day. And then after a couple of weeks, it's just gone. Why? It's not that I ran out of ideas. It's just that I ran out of steam. And that's just kind of how it works for me. I have a character. He's my oldest one. He's grown with me. So he has suffered every single change that I've gone through in life. But he has PTSD in the typical fantasy sense. He saw his wife be killed by the villain of the story. But I never really explore it too deeply. It's more that as he begins to let other people into his life, it heals. He has a real personality, but he pushes people away to avoid getting too close. And then in a recent project, I created a side character who, after his wife was cheating on him and left, he threw himself into his work. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, that's kind of how I handled that situation in my own life. But unlike the others who have more specific, ways that it's come out in their writing, I can't really pick anything too specific.
Well, to respond to both Mike and H.E., for Mike, I was going to say, I have a character who I'm working with for a series that I'm planning right now, and she, first of all, does struggle with PTSD, as well as we discover a dissociative identity disorder throughout the trilogy. But her story is actually based on what would have gone wrong in a particular instance in my life. Specifically, a friend of mine ran away from home and we didn't know if she was alive or dead for 64 days. And at the end of those 64 days, thank goodness we were able to reconnect and she's fine, she's thriving now. But I took this idea and I put it into the character and made it an unhappy ending for her. And so a lot of working with this character and the way that she's developed these different conditions has been a response to me imagining a world in which I did not have the opportunity to heal from that. And then with H.E., she was talking about it, the struggle to work on something every day and produce and all that sort of thing. I have what I think of as the anti-seasonal affective disorder, because I am terribly depressed to an exponentially larger degree during the summer because I am a winter person who needs snow to be okay with myself. And so something that I've really worked with is forgiving myself for doing just what I can during the summer months.
Fun fact, seasonal affective disorder can be reversed. It's just very uncommon to have the version where you get depressed in the summer. I get depressed in the summer, but that's because I have a heat intolerance, so I'm also just not great at all in the summer.
Well, I live in the desert and I hate heat.
Oh.
Sounds like you need to run away.
Yep.
far away.
Anyway, going back to your moderating of the panel, I don't have to take up all the time.
Speaking of writing about characters with depression, have you found that exploring depression in your characters has been cathartic for you or helps you process your emotions in any way?
I'll field that one first. I know I said that I don't really explore it in such a dramatic fashion, not in my typical work, but it doesn't mean that I haven't created little side things that have some of it as well. And the problem with that is that I don't find that those characters end up processing various issues in a more positive way. So when I work with a lot of different characters, I try to create people who are real, people that we have a group of people here right now. Every single one of us is different. So when I create characters, I try to think about all those different aspects, but I'd like to bring out the positives in people. So I get to explore more the best of us when it comes to a lot of situations. That's typically how I go about it.
I don't think it's intentionally cathartic, or even like I don't know if you can cathart depression. I know that's not a word, but I think it's sort of like I'm in a. I like to kind of make eye contact with my depression, not much else, but my depression, and I don't think I'm going to be able to like exercise it or get rid of it. It's sort of there with me, so I'm not looking to like move past it or like I don't know, fix it. I think it's more an exploration. So it's more just like, how does this relate to things that I can sort of externalize? So, I'll have stories where things that I'm pretty sure after I read it a second time around, I'm like, oh, that's a metaphor. I think it's more like that. And it's really more about communicating with this thing that goes on in my brain than it is about like, it being cathartic.
That's interesting. So you really do seem to think of your depression almost as like actually a companion, is what it sounds like. Like it is an entity that exists within your head, but it is almost separate is how you make it sound. That's really interesting.
Not intentionally, but I think, yeah, because I had to wrestle with it so much. When I was first diagnosed, it was in the 80s and 90s. I mean, the resources today aren't great, but back then it was much, much worse. And so I had to do a lot of it on my own. And so I think that was a useful way to sort of like take a step away from, yeah, it's a part of me, but also being able to externalize it helps me, I think.
I can go next. I think for me, the catharsis is not so much in the individual character's depression. I think just thinking of the characters I have that I've written who are depressed, it manifests really differently for them than it does for me in my life. More it's that I want to explore like societies and cultures that are, I guess for lack of a better term, a little more chill about this kind of thing. I like to envision what it would be like in, fantasy universe where a dragon has depression and his family and friends are a little more understanding of it than they would be in the real world, where of course dragons are very intolerant of depression.
True story.
But the comfort for me is in kind of building that society where mental illness is treated with more care and compassion and as a medical need that people have. Because, gosh, doesn't that just sound nice to live in that world?
Well, in the first anthology that I was in, I was writing a short story and it had to have 3 marginalized characteristics. And so I had a time-traveling maiden android as my main character. But where it comes into where I said that my dragon has a panic disorder, this is a story in which the time-traveling maiden android actually manages to save a human colony ship by giving them a secret to keep, which is that they have a dragon on board. And this is very complicated in science fiction, but one thing that I really responded to in terms of the theme or the story that I came out with was a little bit like the Star Trek phenomenon where people are chill with interracial relationships and they're able to embrace alien cultures. It's not entirely an idealized thing, but in this story, I wrote it that the people who are the adults of the ship recognize that they are not going to be the ones who have to have long-term decisions made for this entire society, so they put their faith in the children.
Wow.
And children have fewer borders, in my opinion, in terms of their opinions of what is and is not normal. Normality is something I feel that is taught. And so these children see nothing wrong with giving someone a place in their family as a society, and the adults decide to go with that because they trust them. And that's a little bit idealized, but it is how I feel like the best of society would respond to the atypical.
Writing is in
Are-
many cases about idealization, though. So
Mhm.
I don't think it's something to apologize for.
Well, I feel like I do it a little too much. So, for example, well, I'm just going to be briefly about this, but literally, someone else, I believe it was Mike, was saying that at the beginning of the epidemic lockdown, he had a certain level of productivity. Well, I have for many years have struggled to find an insurance carrier who would cover my mental health treatment. And back in February, I decided that I was going to actually see if my provider would, or my insurance carrier would be able to provide that sort of treatment with a lower cost than I was used to. And since then, I have gotten on antidepressants and I have started talking to a therapist. And so I have this kind of a weird faith throughout the pandemic that things are now a little bit more forgiving of the unexpectedly hard in society. I feel like a lot of people are speaking out more about not necessarily that they have depression or that they have panic, but they are in a state of concern. And I think if anything, this is something that's going to improve our receptivity to each other's needs as we come through this and out of it, God willing.
A lot of our distractions were broken down during this whole event, and it's caused people to do a lot more introspection.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you're absolutely right, and I hope for that as well.
So, on the other side of writing characters with depression, do you ever find that it actually exacerbates your own depression to write a character who is struggling with that?
I haven't personally had that problem. Like I said, I think for me, a lot of my characters manifest their depression a lot differently than mine manifests in me. So I don't really get bogged down by their struggles that they go through because there's enough distance between me mentally and emotionally, um, and their struggles that they're having. So I'm not like latching onto them emotionally, but in situations where I'm writing in a world that isn't necessarily as depression friendly, sometimes if they're dealing with the pressures of a society that doesn't have that kind of compassion towards depression and mental illness, that kind of can bum me out sometimes, and I have to step away for a bit.
For me, it is actually a kind of weird angle to come at it from because I am a person of whom no one will ever expect the chosen one prophetic great quest. I am a person with depression, a person who has a lot of panic attacks, a person with PTSD who is going to largely do the best she can to not screw up other people's lives. On the other hand, I write characters who have much higher stakes and much more personal involvement in the outcome of the society's needs, and trying to write their mental illness or their depression or their struggles without relying on how I interpret them or how I respond to these same sorts of things is very hard for me to do. I remember a friend putting a character in a life or death situation, and she asked me for advice on writing this character recovering from the trauma of nearly being killed at the age of 15. And I gave her this very long description and advice on this, and she goes, but this character has been raised to be resilient. And it completely changed my response to it. And it's not a diss against anyone who has this sort of issue, but it's a recognition that we have to be in acknowledgement of how different every situation is for every person who suffers from these things.
That's a really valid point.
I think more when I was young. when I felt like it was necessary to sort of, bleed art, which I do not buy anymore. I am not of that point of view. Actually, I guess that ties back to the cathartic thing, maybe more again when I was young, right? When I was, what I wrote when I was, and I think weirdly more so if I'm writing how people who should be caring for a character don't, than writing about the experience itself. So I think maybe it's like you were saying, Jasmine, about the response to it, or the world that it's in, and their level of support and understanding, as opposed to the experience itself. It is what it is, but it can be really isolating, and it can be really re-traumatizing and things like that, to have someone just not be able to even just approach it properly, much less help. And I think that more so if I'm writing that, it'll hit me than if I'm writing about it as depression.
Michael, any thoughts?
Thinking back on what I wrote when I was younger, now that it's kind of a topic of discussion, I was thinking about the terrible, angsty poetry that teenagers tend to do, and I realized, thinking on it, it's like that's really where a lot of that came out for me, and I think that that's part of evolution as well. One thing that has always worked, and that I fully believe in, is that writing allows you to create an idealized version of yourself, or the real you, in a way that you can conquer your own demons and difficulties. So I think directly or indirectly, I have created characters that allow me to take certain characteristics and put them in situations where they can thrive. And sometimes they don't. And that's okay, because that's also part of growth and character development.
I think it's important, and not just for the characters themselves, but for the people around them, because I know, at least I have a sister who, when we were both teenagers, we were both much less sympathetic to each other. But as we have both grown up, we have been more honest with each other about things that we've been gone through. And she is the kind of touchstone in my family for how I can talk to the people around me about struggles, and how I can ask for help without it feeling like I'm doing something wrong. So as much as we want to write with it, various illnesses or mental conditions, we can also explore the way that it affects other people and see both the best and worst in them.
I love that. Absolutely. So HE sort of touched on this, but how do you feel as a depressed writer about the trope of the tortured artist and the idea that we must bleed art? How do you reconcile that?
I see it as not exactly a mixed bag, but a mixed blessing for me, because I went to a high school that focused very heavily on the classics. And something that I was taught in all of my literature classes was that the gods grant genius, but the gods grant madness to those geniuses. And so I feel that any kind of mental trial can be a source of inspiration, but it can also be a source of understanding ourselves better.
I wonder about the chicken and egginess of it. Like, I was already bleeding, so I made art to explain it, or am I bleeding for my art? Like, I definitely think I wrote, especially when I was young and didn't have access to any supports at all. I wrote to put stuff somewhere, and then got better at the writing part of it and started writing with intent. So I don't think it was so much bleeding for art as arting for bleeding.
I'm actually as well a musician, and I remember having a slight guilt trip when I was a teenager, because I realized that my best recitals were after I had been yelled at by someone. So I started picking fights with my parents before I would go to a recital, just so I could be flawless.
That's kind of tender.
I don't advise
sort of
that,
love
I don't advise that as a coping mechanism because you grow up to be a very, very weird adult with unhealthy relationships at times.
That's teenager logic for you, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I need to be yelled at to do well at a show.
Well,
I
the end
know.
result was actually when I published my first book, there's a moment in which her father, who is a police officer, is injured on the line of duty. And my mother came back after reading my book and said, "Did you nearly kill the father because you hate your dad?" I'm like, no, that has nothing to do. No, that's not what I meant. So be careful what you use. True story. Anyway, that was a little bit of a tangent.
I think going off what Aichi was saying about the chicken and egg situation, I think that kind of trope of the tortured artist is very relatable to a lot of creative types for that reason. Like when you're in pain, you use art as an expression of that pain. But I think that trope is still kind of dangerous in that it really kind of romanticizes suffering in a way that isn't productive. Speaking as someone who went most of my life without getting medical attention for my mental illnesses and only very recently has started getting that medical attention that I should have probably been getting the whole time. The difference in my art output, I feel like, is just whether or not I'm in extreme amounts of unnecessary pain as I'm creating the art, and that the end product is not really affected one way or the other, except insofar as I can draw from my experiences with depression and other mental illnesses to inform the things I write. But the actual experience of suffering is not really helpful, and that kind of trope, I think, is in a dangerous position of setting up this expectation that's to creative types. That's like, well, if you want to be successful or if you want to create good art, you should be suffering. And if you have depression, you shouldn't seek treatment for it. And I don't think that's the answer.
Yeah, I think that last part especially is really important to consider because we're also so often told that if we medicate our depression, that will ruin our creativity.
Yeah,
That's a really huge part of the tortured
I have
artist
not
trope.
found that at all to be the case.
Amen.
Yeah, and if that is the case, it usually means you need to try a different medication. Unfortunately,
yep.
the reality is brains are all different and you can't just assume the first one will work. Sometimes you got to try 2 or 3 or 4. That's why we have so many different kinds of antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds and these kinds of things.
The right one for you won't medicate your muse away.
Yeah. Well said. Michael, did you want to add anything to that?
Jasmine hit on exactly what I was going to say, that I find that whole trope is highly romanticized and overly romanticized. And then the idea of not taking care of yourself. Now, granted, we're in a different age now. You go back in time, people suffered because that was the world. They didn't understand it. We barely understand the brain right now, but we're working on it. So the idea of living with demons, you don't have to. You can create with or without. So I think that it's dangerous. I think the romanticization of it for real people outside of creative works, it causes more detriment than not. That's why I'm saying I do completely agree with you on that. It's possible that a lot of our great artists would not have committed suicide or have died young if we had a better understanding of it. And we get that trope from people like that. Even in modern times, if you look at, Robin Williams' death and the idea that he was depressed and then it came out he might have had a brain issue and all this other stuff. People don't see when there's a smile on someone's face. And there's a lot of times where people don't fix their issues because they're afraid that it will kill their creativity. A good example is I might mess up which artist it was, but I'm pretty sure it's Freddie Mercury didn't get his teeth fixed because he was afraid it would affect his singing.
That's
So
fascinating.
I believe it was him.
Yeah, it was.
Okay, thank you. I just remembered it off the top of my head, so I'm like, I don't know.
Trust the super queer to know
Same
about Freddie
with Barbara
Mercury's
Streisand.
face.
Barbara Streisand refused to get a nose job because she was concerned it would change her voice.
Really?
Yep.
Those are things where you're changing something physical,
hmm
and it can affect what you're working on. But when you're talking mentally, it's a completely different scenario.
I like that you used the word demon when you were talking about that because, like I said, I'm a huge classics nerd, and the word demon actually comes from the word for wisdom. And so it is something that it can be a malevolent force, but it is also an informative force as well. And with the artists drawing on their things, there's a composer I admire quite a lot named Dmitry Shostakovich, and he was composing during the Stalinist era of Soviet Russia. And they kept on telling him that in order for the state to approve of his things, they should have a more optimistic Shostakovich. And he used to kind of joke about this, but the one thing that really struck me was this story of him composing his symphony for the city of Leningrad during the Second World War, when it was the longest siege on history that we have recorded. And throughout the composition score, you actually have this notation of two letters that I don't know the actual Russian words for them because I don't speak Russian, obviously, but it refers to the air raid strikes. And so you see throughout the work not only this immense work of profound sympathy and empathy and mourning for the Russian people at that time, but you also see these moments at which he was disrupted by forces beyond his control in a very real sense. And so I think it's important that we understand that there are in every person who is a creative type, there are these disruptions, and there are things that we can and cannot do to kind of acknowledge them and work with them.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. And that also, touches on part of the reason I think that we have this idea of the tortured artist is because so many of, the canon artists are people who lived through or fought in one or both world wars, or, all of these like huge world changing tragic events. And so they sort of had that trauma built in, but that doesn't mean that future artists have to have that.
Artists can actually have wonderful opuses without having to go out and accidentally got shot by someone on the no or demilitarized zone.
Exactly.
Right. I always think about Tolkien in that respect. If I remember correctly, the inspiration for the Dead Marshes within Lord of the Rings was because of him being in the trenches in World War I. And
that is correct.
I don't have to go back in time to get that type of situation. I could look at photographs or read accounts of it and get a feel for what that type of situation was like. It is a benefit to ourselves in the modern age. But I do fully agree. We don't have to go off and create trauma to create art. But there is a good argument that a lot of the times art does come from trauma.
Well, this is going to be a little bit of a, not exactly whimsical, but a different tack on this. There's a song that I grew up with that says, you don't have to push a handcart, leave a family dear, or walk 1,000 miles or more to be a pioneer. And it's talking about the idea that you can find your own definition of bravery in yourself without having to go through things that push you to the limit, because everyone's experience is going to be different. And I think of this often when I'm writing a character in which or a scene in which a character is in some kind of great pain or extreme distress, and I can not imagine what it's like to have your arm amputated, but I can imagine the shock, I can imagine the vulnerability you feel at that point. And so everything that we do experience, no matter how severe it is, can be used to inform that.
I think it's fair to say too, since all of us are living through the year 2020, we've all had, I think, enough traumatic events now, so no one needs to go search out anymore. Like we all have enough to qualify as tortured artists, so we're good.
Yeah, 2020 has given us all the tortured artist baseline.
Yeah.
Now
We've
you
got
can
the
just
minimum
focus
covered.
on healing. It's fine. You've got it down.
Well, and there are brilliant healing narratives to be written too,
Mhm.
right? Like,
Absolutely.
how many beautiful stories are about sort of finding your way through something, or discovering beautiful small things along the way through something hard, right? I
Mhm.
mean, Lord of the Rings, how much, back to Tolkien, how much was actually accomplishing the mission and how much was the journey to the mission, right? So
Right.
I think it's okay to find hopeful narratives. I hope so, because otherwise a lot of my stories aren't going to go anywhere.
Well, you opened up a can of worms, because my podcast is actually not psychoanalyzing, but deep diving into Tolkien. And so we just finished The Hobbit, and there's a line at the end of that book in which Gandalf, who's been the person driving this entire adventure, looks at the Hobbit, who at the beginning of the book didn't even want to have unwanted dinner guests over. And he says, there is something the matter with you. And at first glance, that looks like something, oh, Gandalf is always judging him for not being an adventurous type. No, I read it as, there is something of substance to you.
Oh, I like it.
Interesting.
Well, that's it. That's all we need there.
I think
leave
that's
it to
the shortest
Tolkien
time I've
to.
ever talked about Tolkien in my life, but
The world needs more whimsical writing. It needs a simplicity of story. Anyone that was in the panel I was with this morning, the writing habits one, I mentioned I'd watched a lot of samurai films recently, a lot of the old Kurosawa films, and with those, it's interesting going back to how storytelling in film was back in the 50s. Even though it was a violent time period in history and it's a violent situation, there was camaraderie between the characters. There was humor that seemed very organic. I think people still want positive stories with good endings. And when you're dealing with, especially with a tough year like this, I think those types of stories are more what people are looking for. I won't go too far into it, but the news is always negative. It doesn't matter what it is. People want something a little bit better. We seek it. And I think that's where people who have experienced things can come in and say, hey, listen, it's not all doom and gloom. It doesn't have to be continued. We can finish the story on a positive note, even if it was grimdark 90% of it. And, referencing The Hobbit again, I love The Hobbit because I always found it's a very positive book overall.
Mhm.
I think that's what his intention was, since it is a children's book, really. And it was also the first book I read to my son, so it's a little special.
It's the first book my dad read to me. But I was talking very much earlier about representation and how we need to see the recognition of people struggling through things. But I think it's also important to be fair that in these circumstances, there will be people who do not have the depth of suffering or the same aspect of suffering. I have a friend who is a licensed therapist, and she responded to all the stress and tragedy and everything by contacting the American Red Cross and being trained as a trauma counseling for people in FEMA areas. And so she has been recently in Louisiana helping people who are living in shelters who are recovering from these hurricanes. And so everyone, be they neurotypical, atypical, neurodiverse, mentally well, mentally ill, in denial, acknowledging what they have, we have to be inclusive of every kind of experience as best as we are able.
Absolutely. And, it's really important to understand too that there are a lot of people who are right now going through this kind of thing for the very first time in their lives. Like us, this panel, we're all old hands. We've been at this whole depression thing for a while. We've developed coping strategies. But a lot of people are suffering right now for the first time, and it is important to acknowledge that and to be gentle with those people.
I think it's also, but I was saying earlier that God willing, we will come out of this with better understanding of it. And I think a lot of people will be understanding of themselves in which they have seen for years certain ways that they are affected by things and they have coping strategies, but they are not willing, they are now more able to see where those things have reached their limit and they have found ways to grow and to understand that things are not as easy as they have been able to do up until this point. It's really crossing a line from suspecting some kind of disease or some kind of disorder to having a diagnosis to having a treatment. And so I think that's something that I not exactly look forward to, but I have hope for people who have seen this part of themselves.
So I guess we are coming to 10 minutes to time. If anyone does want to, in the audience, does want to throw in any questions, or if any of you want to ask the rest of the group a question, we can make time for that. But for the moment, I'm just gonna ask, how has since we've sort of started talking about this, how has 2020 specifically impacted your coping and your level? Do you find that you're feeling worse, or have you been sort of on an even keel since you sort of were already kind of, you know? And have you found that your normal coping strategies work, or have you had to find new ones?
I will respond first and finally actually like shut my mouth for once since I've spent so much time rambling today. But I did not realize until these last 6 months how much of my depression is affected by loneliness and by a sense of isolation. And so the only way I've been able to really respond to it, other than doing my best to write and doing my best to share joy through my Tolkien podcast that we started in May, was every week I just sit down at my piano and I share something of the arts by playing 2 pieces and sending them out to Facebook. And it's my way of saying I need a way to cope with this, but also saying I hope this helps you cope. And that's all I'll say for the rest of this panel, unless really provoked.
I guess for me, 2020 is not my worst year. I was having this conversation with my partner that if we were looking back over it, it might not even be second, possibly. No, I'm not even sure it would crack top 10. So,
wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's not great, but I'm also in a position now to like, I have so much of what I have to support me is better now than it was for a lot of the other things that I've gone through. I definitely think that there are people who have been through a lot that can contribute a lot right now, even if it's just that I have the capacity to give encouraging words to my friends or just to send, messages. I saw someone who said, every time I see something negative online, I send someone a boost. And I'm like really digging that right now. I'm just like, you're awesome. I love you. Okay, off. So I will say, yeah, I do think the circumstances that contributed to worsening my depression prepped me for this year. Mm-hmm. And also caused trouble for me this year because isolation makes things worse. Lack of sunlight makes things worse. There's a lot of things that that I could be doing that I do for my physical health and my mental health that I don't have access to right now. So I'm having to adapt. Some of those adaptations, though, I'm going to keep. So it's a mixed bag for me, partly because I do have privileges and supports that I didn't have before. So 2020, the mixed bag.
Jasmine?
Yeah, I think 2020 is also not the worst year for me. As I mentioned earlier, I was pretty late in my life getting medical attention for my mental illnesses that I've had since I was a small child. So by the time the 2020 rolled around and the pandemic kicked in, my baseline for my mental wellness had kind of really shifted from what it had been up until that point in my life. But I still had that experience of having untreated mental illness for about 25, 26 years. So I had the coping mechanisms there, but also I was just doing better in general because I was getting that treatment. So I'm doing okay in the pandemic. I mean, it helps that I'm a homebody, so I do kind of like being home all the time anyway. And it's only really recently that it's just been going on for so long that now my coping mechanisms, it looks like are going to have to start changing, because despite being the biggest introvert I know, I'm now being like, I would give anything to talk to like a human stranger at this point in my life. So
Well,
that's
then,
something that
I
have
guess
to
this
adapt.
panel's been great for you.
Yeah, I've been having a lot of fun here for that exact reason. So that's, yeah, something I have to adapt to. But in the grand scheme of things, that's a pretty minor change to make to my life. Not a lot of cost on my end. So I'm doing okay overall, I think.
Well, I'm in the same boat. 2020 is not my worst year. And again, and it's similar. It's like, I'm already writing. I play video games and I write. That's what I do. The only other thing that I did most of the time was I would date, and I'd started doing a little bit more out of door things, and that kind of stunk having that taken away. It's like you start going to places and then it's like, all right, I'm finally changing some habit. No, you're going to stay inside for the next forever. Oh, great. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
but you know, the truth of the matter is that I miss certain things, and that's been very tough for me, because when I can't do anything else and I'm not being productive, I realize just how much it affects me to not have something going on. I miss I live next to a grocery store. I miss just being able to walk over there and grab something random if I want. Now I'm like, I don't really want to get all dressed up to go buy chips. I'll wait till I shop in 2 weeks. Now it's great for my diet, but that's not true. I just ordered pizza. So.
Yeah, I was gonna say I live across the street from a grocery store, so I understand you on that. But no, it hasn't been great for my diet.
No.
It's been great for Uber Eats.
As soon as the gym closed, I knew I was in trouble, but I kept thinking, you know, it's not going to be that long. I don't trust it what anyone tells me. When someone said it's going to be a couple weeks, I said, okay, a month. And then when they said a month, it's okay, it's going to be another month. And I just kept thinking we would have some level of normalcy before now. And like you said, Jasmine, after it goes on for so long, you start to see cracks in how you take care of things. But on the plus side, the National Novel Writing Month will be kicking off in November.
Yay!
That'll be another long project that I'll get done, and then I'll not finish because I'll realize, oh man, this doesn't fit where I want my narrative right now. I did that last year. Oh, it was great. Someday
I
I'll
don't
finish
think
that
any
project.
of us have ever had that problem.
Never.
It's not like I've done NaNoWriMo for 15 years and maybe had 3 books out of it done successfully.
I've actually only really attempted to do it for 2 years, and the first time I did it was the last novel I produced. And last year I was doing a magic school type of story. I wanted something that was more slice of life and exciting in that way. And I got over the 50K words, and I looked at it and I said, if I finish this and try to publish it, I'm going to reveal all my secrets for my long-term project. It's going to have to wait. So I put it on the back burner, but we'll see what comes up with 2020.
Good luck. All right, so we have 1 minute left.
I like what
To
Alexa's
wrap
saying
up,
there in chat.
can you just give your if you could only give one piece of advice to a writer struggling with depression, what would it be? And just quickly rattle off your social media profiles so people can find you.
I'll give the same piece of advice I gave this morning for anyone that wasn't there. You need to be yourself. Don't worry about comparing yourself to someone else, because you're not them. You're you. And comparison will make it difficult. And you can follow me on Twitter at Blank Slate Works. Blank Slate Works. It's all one word. Blankslateworks.net is my website. I have free content and reviews and all kinds of stuff on there.
I am at Khaki Olson Creative on Instagram and khakiolsoncreative.com, as well as Khaki O Creative on Twitter. And if you were sitting here and going, my gosh, I bet she could talk for 20 hours about Bilbo Baggins, my podcast is called A Sacred Fellowship. But my one piece of writing advice kind of dovetails with Mike's. It's to be true to what your muses were prompting you to write.
I would advise, my advice would be keep your writing varied. If you're finding yourself stuck, just mix it up sometimes. Drafting, editing, outlining, making your characters in The Sims, making Spotify playlists, whatever. I know it sounds like cheating, but whatever, you know, keeps you creative and keeps you invested in what you're writing. It's okay to not worry about the, you know, how many words did you write today kind of measurement of progress. There's so many ways to be creative. Oh, and my Twitter handle is JAS_Gower, and my website is jasminegower.com, and I put those links in the share profiles channel on the Discord too.
I think when it comes to depression, my writing advice is it's okay to go a day or a week or a year or a decade, because I've done that, without writing and come back to it. And that it's okay to say, I can't write 1,000 words today, I'm gonna write 10. I can't write 10, I'm gonna read 10. I can't read 10, I'm gonna watch TV and notice what I like about it. I can't watch TV, I'm gonna sit in my room and stare at the ceiling and think of 10 words to describe the color of my ceiling. Like, writing doesn't have to follow like these rules about you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. Be very, very forgiving of yourself when it comes to writing and depression, because, you know, it's there and it's waiting for you. And it's not gone because you can't access it right now. It's just kind of behind a curtain. I am at HECasson on Twitter. I am HECasson.com, and I'm HECasson. Yay.
All right. Thank you very much, folks. Have a lovely day and get some rest. I know that it has been quite the weekend.
Thank you so much, Diana.
Thank you too, Diana.
Thank you.